We were already here 20 years before the white cane was invented. We were here when blind boss Chris Buckley still ruled the city of San Francisco as an old-time Paul. We were here when Newell Perry was still getting his mathematics PhD in Germany. We were here 30 years before the first recorded books for the blind. We were here 18 years before the first guide dog school. And we were here when Helen Keller was still in college. But blind history goes back a lot further than that. It goes back, 2,500 years. Democritus, maybe we'll hear about him in a moment. Why do we care about history? It's interesting philosophically, but it's more interesting because as blind people or people who are becoming blind or newly blind, history gives us a sense of peoplehood, of mission, of belonging, and of the power of our stories, which for various reasons that Leona will go into may not be at the tip of our culture and may not be part of our conversations. So a bit about Leona. She's a local product. She grew up in the outer Richmond. She went to doctors in the old Letterman Hospital when her original vision diagnosis happened. And in the fine tradition of many San Franciscans of accomplishment, she dropped out of high school here. She did some worked a little bit at CCSF. And along the way, I learned she volunteered one summer at our Enchanted Hills camp. She studied at UC Santa Cruz, and of course, moving to the East Coast and getting a PhD in 2009. So Leona is not just an academic. I particularly like that she's a woman out there performing in open mics, moonlighting as a performance artist of various kinds, stand-up, accordion, storytelling, all this kind of stuff. Really one of the cool blind people out there that I wished I knew when I became blind.
Oh.
So Leona, let me start with this question. There are a lot of histories of the blind out there. What did you want to accomplish with yours, and what new ground are you breaking?
Oh, that is such a great question. What got me interested in kind of histories of the education of the blind, so specifically the kind of the middle chapters of the book, were definitely it was inspired by books like Journey into Light by Ishbel Ross, kind of a lot of mid-century histories of the education of the blind. And I remember when I first read Journey into Light by Ishbel Ross, I kind of always had it in my mind that I would want to write some sort of sweeping history of blindness and blind people from the days of Homer, because I was a classics major when I was in UC Santa Cruz. And so I always knew that I wanted to write this kind of history, but I wanted it to be more personal. And it was important for me to be kind of involved and speaking to the proximity of some of these moments and some of these characters in our long Western tradition of blindness and of blind people, blind characters. I wanted to be able to write a book that was both historical and personal, so that I could really draw attention to the fact that a lot of these ideas have been with us for thousands of years and are still with us and still having an impact on how sighted people see us and how we see ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And I love that in your book, there are many portraits of people we know, the sort of giants in the catechism of blindness, Helen Keller and Milton and so forth. But I love some of the lesser known people that you profiled and spoke about their significance. And I wonder if you might talk about one. The guy who followed Isaac Newton in the Lucasian chair of mathematics. Tell us about Nicholas Saunderson, not only in his accomplishments, but also how he wrestled with the dynamic with church and individual perception.
Yeah, that's great. Nicholas Saunderson was somebody who came to my attention through one of the kind of giants of Enlightenment thought. So that's Denis Diderot. He had a book, kind of a small, probably it was at the time a treatise, so not super long, but it's called Letter on the Blind for the Use of Those Who See. And I would like to particularly draw attention to the second half of that title. So for the use of those who see. So Diderot was he's often thought of as being one of the first people to think about what blind people, as blind people, can tell us about the world. And so he uses, because all the rage, I should go back a little bit. So all the rage sort of at the late 17th, early 18th century was kind of brought about by Locke's, by the Molyneux question. Perhaps that's familiar to some people, the Molyneux man. So the idea of curing blindness and what a newly sighted blind person could tell us philosophically about sight and blindness. But for the first time, Diderot thinks that maybe we could learn something from a blind person as a blind person, not suddenly restored to sight. And so one of his examples in the Letter on the Blind is Nicholas Saunderson. He was already dead at the time of Diderot's writing about him in 1749. So we'll never know how Saunderson might have thought about how Diderot presented him. But one interesting thing is that he presented him as a very strong and vibrant atheist on his deathbed. And it really seems to me to be, and he also presented him as someone who had ideas about evolution, about I think 60 years before Darwin was born. So he really puts into the mouth of his Saunderson, and I should say that this is Diderot probably being a bit fanciful with this blind mathematician, but puts into his mouth things that had really never been said by a blind person before. Oftentimes, blind people were used in religious contexts to kind of speak to the spiritual, to the realms beyond human sight, namely God. But this was the first time that a blind man was there to really speak to the new scientific revolution. And I think that that's why it caught my attention when I first read about him in Diderot.
Mm-hmm. And another woman that you mentioned, Maria Teresa von Paredes.
Yeah.
Now there's a woman with substantial accomplishment, and also she's very complicated. Mind telling a bit about her story?
Yes, and so she is also firmly in kind of in Enlightenment Europe, so 18th century, kind of in Vienna in the time of Mozart, also in the time of a infamous character named Franz Anton Mesmer. So Maria Theresia was, we don't really know why she was blind. There's a lot of sort of speculation about how she went blind, but it seems to have happened when she was 3 years old. It seems to have been quite sudden. Speculation that it was somehow some sort of nervous fit. So we really don't know. But the mystery around her blindness allowed for Dr. Mesmer, and that's where we get the word mesmerized from. It came along and said, I can cure her with my magnets. And so he takes her to his hospital, which was also his house, where he had many Viennese musicians play often, but he also had kind of a hospital part of his house, and waved some magnets around and somehow affected her animal magnetism so that she could suddenly see again. Now, again, we don't really know what happened. But what's really interesting about this story is she was maybe about 17 or 18 when she met Mesmer. What's interesting is that in all accounts, when she received her sight back, she could no longer play her instruments. She would get distracted. She would sort of fumble all over the piano keyboard and not and before she was able to sort of hold long conversations and play at the same time. That's kind of the account of it. So her parents take her away from Mesmer's care, and there's apparently lots of kind of tantrums, people crying, yelling, swords were drawn, all sorts of things. Goes back to her parents' house, is somehow blind again, and resumes her long and wonderful career as a musician and singer and composer, and eventually teacher as well. And what is interesting also about this is that there's a guy named Valentin Hauy, and I call him Howie because it's easier. His name is spelled H-A-U umlaut Y, who's often called the father of the blind. And so when she is on her big European tour, she opens up her, after her performances, she opens up her salon to show to people her pedagogical instruments, as they were called at the time. So raised maps and letters. This is, of course, before Braille, but she did learn how to read using sort of carved block letters. She was apparently able to use kind of a printing press of some sort and keep up a correspondence. So Valentin Hauy sees these things and is finally feels like he's able to open up the very first school for the blind in Paris. And so sort of the rest is blind history insofar as he opens up the first school for the blind. About 50 years later, Louis Braille goes to that school and, you know, invents a little precious gift called Braille. So that's how she's connected to that kind of larger story.
Mm-hmm. It's such a delicious web of people. Each one was the pivot of what was to follow.
Yes.
Well, somewhere in your book, you had a remarkable, astounding line that said that when most sighted people look into the eyes of blind people, they often see nothing but themselves.
Mm.
And you're talking here about the way culture in general uses blind people as a kind of Rorschach to project on other cultural considerations of sighted people, and that our voices are often lost there. And you use a term throughout your book, oculocentrism. I wonder if you can tell me about some of the cultural dynamics there, and about why is oculocentrism something we need to be worried about?
Yeah, gosh, there's so much to say. I think I'll start by saying that a big tension that drives my book is that blind people tend to be either sort of held above the rest of humanity as, say, blind poets or prophets, or these days superheroes, or on the far other end of the pendulum swing, as sort of pitiable or helpless. And I really wanted to expose this problem because I feel like either way, in either case, actual blind people like ourselves are not allowed to just be normal. Like the very idea of a normal blind person, I think oftentimes does not compute in the eyes of a sighted person. And so I really wanted to kind of bridge that gap. So a lot of the characters that I bring into my book are characters from literature, and I kind of compare them side by side with lived blind experience as I learned from my own friends, from my own experience, from reading lots of memoirs written by blind people. So trying to kind of bridge that giant gap between either being sort of held above or held far below the average sighted person. And that kind of leads me to the idea that in many texts, in many novels and movies, the blind character tends to be kind of a sidekick to the sighted protagonist. And it tends to be that the blind character reveals something, right? Sort of ironic cliche, really. Like the blind person sees something, reveals something to the sighted protagonist that allows them to kind of continue on their way as the complicated, messy human protagonist that oftentimes the blind character isn't ever allowed to kind of be that kind of messy character. They tend to be more stereotyped. So all of that kind of led me to the idea that ocular centrism is kind of at the heart of this problem, or it's one of the hearts of this problem. And that is to say, ocular centrism is not about it's not about being a visual person. So in other words, one of my sort of how do you say it, my cheers for this book is down with ocular centrism, right? Trying to dismantle the evil empire of ocular centrism. And when I say that, it doesn't mean I want everybody who's sighted to, like, pull an Oedipus and poke out their eyes or anything. I really want people who are sighted to kind of think about maybe two major things. And one is that being sighted is a wonderful thing, but it is not the only way to be. And I guess that's the difference between being visual, which is perfectly fine. You can't help it. You've got eyes, you're going to look around, you're visual, and being ocular centric, which is to say, believing that because you have vision, that you are better than those who do not have vision. And I think the other point to kind of keep in mind is that it kind of limits our thinking, right? It's not only for blind people that I say down with ocular centrism, it's for everybody, because I feel like our world is limited because of our sort of sight-centric bias. I mean, think about this, think about if the world was filled with, curious blind scientists thinking about sight or blindness or totally different problems that face our world. Blind creators, blind movie makers, blind novelists. Think how much more interesting our world would be. I guess that's really part of it, is that I like the idea of diversity that speaks to our human thirst for knowledge, and allowing for kind of different ways of exploring the world to come to the fore, to come to the foreground, as opposed to just being kind of sidekicks to the sighted.
Yeah, you had a nice line in there about how mostly blind people are portrayed for their heroic accomplishments despite blindness rather than their actual accomplishments.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that it's a long tradition, right? I mean, even Helen Keller, I mean, we all think that she was just revered her whole life and, had this kind of magical life. And she really railed against it, of being held up as a saint, of not being able to speak to the real social ills of her day because people just wanted her to be speaking about blindness all the time. And it was a frustration, that she dealt with her whole long life. And so it's something that's not new. And I guess that's, again, why I really wanted to make this a personal history, to show that some of the things that a lot of us struggle with as individuals alive today are connected with these very long histories.
Mm-hmm. Throughout the book, you take a dive into blindness and gender. And especially there was a line where you said that blind women, more than men, are often more circumspect in talking about their own desires, their own feelings, their own personhood. Why is that? And how is that changing?
Ooh, that's an easy question. I would start by saying it's important to realize that the other aspects of who we are absolutely inflect our experience of blindness. So I do think that gender inflects blindness, as does race or where you are raised, or all kinds of things. Gender is particularly interesting because I do think that historically, most times, the way to kind of get people to sit up and pay attention to the blind person is often by displaying what have been in our history typically male endeavors. I think here, for example, of Holman, right? Of James Holman. I mean, very much love that you all named the Holman Prize for the world, the blind traveler. But you think about how impossible it would have been for a Victorian woman to do what he did. And I think it's probably even more impossible in some ways to think about, yeah, I guess it's impossible to think of a Victorian woman doing it, whether she was blind or sighted, right? I mean, I think that's the thing, is that when you are a woman in a patriarchal society, then if you're blind, you've got kind of two fights to fight. And so I guess that's one aspect of it. It's also, well, I know it's lunchtime, but we said we might get a little bit sexy here. So I think it's also a problem of sex and of blind people kind of being denied their sexuality, and that goes double for women. I guess that's what I can say about that, is that it feels as though there's something sort of so precious about blindness wrapped up with kind of rather conservative ideas about what a woman is, that it really makes it quite hard, I think, for a lot of women and men to express their sexuality as blind people. So, and then all the kind of the train of associations of pigeonholing that our society does in terms of men and women, I think, are even more like exaggerated in terms of blindness.
Mm-hmm. You know, we're among friends here, Leona. We are a community-based organization. We work with thousands of people who are newly blind, becoming blind, have been blind for a long time, and want to learn stuff. And I was taken by your honesty about your own journey into blindness, and especially you mentioned at one point that you feared the look of being blind. You feared being observed as being blind more than you did blindness itself. And at other points you said that the stuff of blindness, those cassette players and the cassette books in those earlier days, or even the white cane, these were things that you felt shameful and were reluctant to use and hid for as long as you possibly could, like so many others, including me.
Yeah.
But where does that shame come from?
Yeah. Well, this is where reading all the blind memoirs was really useful, especially for those of us who have progressive eye disease. So we come to blindness with all the misconceptions of the sighted world. And I think a big misconception is, this stigmatic white cane, that it's somehow like it's a really useful tool, right? It's a very, very useful tool. It keeps us from, falling downstairs in an undignified fashion, keeps us, from doing all sorts of things, and also signifies to the sighted world that we are blind. So it's an extremely useful tool that has somehow become a symbol of helplessness, which is so frustrating, right? And so I think that because it's so stigmatic, a lot of us are afraid to use it because it's so sudden, right? It's like, it's this either or. Either you're kind of pretending to be sighted, walking around, and then suddenly you pick up the cane and then the world sees you as totally blind. And it's a scary thing for us. Where does it come from? Man, it feels so ingrained. And again, I think that this speaks to the lack of representation. I think this speaks to the lack of normality of being a blind person. The fact that, we don't have images of blind mothers and fathers and just blind people just going to work, right? Using the white cane, using a dog. These images aren't with us. And so I think it just seems plain scary for a lot of us who suddenly enter blindness or gradually enter blindness to pick up that cane and be suddenly seen by the world as something other than what you've come to know yourself as, which is, like a normal person, right? And I say that in quotes, right? Because there's no reason why you can't have a normal blind person. Those two things, I think, feel like an oxymoron in the minds of many sighted people, but we all know that there are perfectly ordinary blind people everywhere. I'm sure there's a few out there in the audience today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, when I became blind, I needed to know cool blind people, and I needed to know our history. And so I wonder what turned it around for you.
Ooh,
What
yeah.
made you take those steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I am honest in the book that I'm still wrestling with some of this stuff. You know, I mean, you can become blind in an instant, but it's a little harder to slough off the preconceptions of what blindness is. I think that it can be difficult because it does feel like when you're out there in the world, sighted people will kind of break down barriers a lot. You know, ask questions of you when you're just simply walking down the street and stuff. So it does make it difficult. I guess I'm following up on that. Now, what made it change is absolutely my investigation and my playing with ideas that came to me in my research. I mean, maybe one of the beyond you know, learning about Homer and John Milton, I think a big one was when I learned that Helen Keller performed in vaudeville. And I remember very distinctly, I was in the middle of the 17th, 18th century literature, and I came across this book called The Radical Lives of Helen Keller, which speaks to her leftist politics, her radical politics. And there was a little throwaway line about how she performed in vaudeville. And at the time, as you said at the top of the hour, I also was sort of moonlighting. I was doing writing my dissertation, but I was also moonlighting as a performance artist. So I was doing all kinds of crazy stuff with loop pedals and stand-up comedy, and all very indifferently successful, but it was a lot of fun. And as soon as I read this, that Helen Keller was a performer for 4 years, from 1920 to 24, I thought to myself, I need to do something with this. And maybe that is the definitive turning point, really, is how exciting blind culture seemed to me suddenly. It wasn't just, you know, kind of this faraway idea of John Milton or Homer, but it was this fact of a woman who is so iconic, on the one hand, not being allowed to have that part of her story. So few of us know about the vaudeville stint. You know, I think a lot of people were quite ashamed of her or felt like she was being exploited, but she was 40 years old and a very smart woman, right? She was not being exploited. She knew exactly what she was doing. And she got to kind of pontificate about her lefty politics in the Q&A period. So she was very aware of what she was doing. And so to have somebody that iconic not be able to be like a full, messy, interesting person was something that I really wanted to explore, and then got excited about the idea of blind culture, you know, and wanting to kind of push it forward every way I can.
And beyond the rarefied examples from literature, research, or scholarly stuff, you yourself have faced discrimination. You mentioned a few parts in your book. You want to tell us the story of the Norwegian professor?
Oh, the Norwegian professor. Yes. So I was in graduate school at the time, and I was at NYU, probably fourth year graduate student, and there came an email from the department, from the English department where I was, that there was a Norwegian sociologist who was going to be in New York for a few months, I think 2 or 3 months, and he wanted some help with his written English. And so I had a guide dog at the time, Millennium, lovely black lab, and I walked down the street from my office up at the English department down to his office down on the Bowery, and walk in and get as far as the elevator and walked out of into the kind of open space of the administrative assistant. And I guess I said, you know, I'm here to see so-and-so, Professor so-and-so. And I guess she told him. And so he comes running out and he says, no, 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 no. I cannot work with you. I have so little time. This is not possible. And it was really that dramatic. And I was just kind of standing there amazed. You know, I said, well, I'm a fourth year English major, you know, fourth year PhD student, you know, like I can do this. I have a laptop right here in my bag. You can send me anything you need to do. We can, you know, I kind of explained the technology to him. And still, he was very adamant. He said, no, I don't have enough time. I'm sure you can do this, but not sort of in the way that I need you to do it. And so we just stood there and we argued for a good 10 minutes. And my guide dog kind of laid down and was like, okay, we're going to be here in this hallway for a little while. And finally I said, look, I've been here for 10 minutes now. I'm already here. Why don't we just give it a go? Okay, let's just give it a go. And I think that it was simply him giving up, him not really believing that I could do it, but him just giving up, because it was true. I was there, and what is that, 9/10 of the law, right? So I won. And we went into his office and I opened up my laptop and I started helping him. And right away we had kind of an interesting little, I helped him with a word that he had confused that I got to pull out my rusty Latin and kind of help him out with. And by the end of it, we were pals, and I ended up working with him for the rest of the time that he was there, the next 2 or 3 months.
I love that story.
But there was so much I had to do, right? I mean, if I were maybe a couple of years younger, or, not quite so sure of myself with the PhD behind me and all that stuff, it would have been very hard, to not just say, oh, okay, and back right out, into the elevator. So I guess I put that out there as like kind of a happy story, but it's one that we all go through. And I think we lose a lot of those kinds of battles too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have one last question before we turn it open for the audience. We're all on a journey of blindness, self-actualization, learning, and becoming. I think of the span of your life in blindness, from reluctance to use a cane or to use those tapes and all that, to now flying on refreshable Braille displays and being a productive academic in all manners. But what's ahead for you? What's still not figured out? What is on your future path of blindness actualization?
Oh my goodness. Well, I have lots of improvement to make. I love Braille. I am still quite slow. I've used audio for so long, but I did get my refreshable Braille display about a year ago, and that really made a difference, because the big challenge for me with getting books from the library was that I felt like I was never getting the books that I wanted or needed. So that's pretty much of a game changer, but it's going to be a little while before my brain catches up and my fingers catch up and that I'm a really proficient Braille reader. So that's in progress. I'll say that same with cane travel. It's a work in progress. I think those of you out there, that are listening or watching today, probably a lot of us have progressive eye diseases that make it very hard to know like when to make adjustments. So I'm still working on my cane skills, that's for sure. Still working on the Braille skills. I feel like sometimes when you're adult, what makes it harder to learn and adapt is just because there's so many other things for us to be dealing with at the same time. And that can, it's like I can work so quickly with my audio speech output computer. And so sometimes, I feel like, oh, I need to just get this done fast, instead of saying, well, maybe I could do this a little slower and work on my Braille skills, so that's something that I'm still kind of working on. I tell a story in the book that there's this man named Jacob Torski, and he lived a good part of the 20th century, and he wrote several books, a couple of novels. And he describes life in the blind school of the Bronx, I believe it was, back in the 1920s and 30s. And he talks about the boys at school that weren't very good at being blind, like they're the ones that sort of were, bumping into things. And the kids that were good at being blind, they called these other boys blindish. So in other words, if you weren't good at being blind, then you were blind-ish, which I love, because I told my partner Alabaster that story, and he said, oh, right, so being blind is like a skill set. And I was like, yes, that's exactly right. So I guess my final remark on this is that I'm still working on being full-fledged blind.
And may we always continue to do it. And now you're going to hear from some of the folks who teach blind folks how to improve that skill set, and for our community members as well. So I think, excellent. Andrea, are you going to coordinate the Q&A now?
Yes, hi everyone. This is Andrea. I am the event coordinator here. And if you want to type a question in the chat box or raise your hand, I see already there's a couple of questions, but there is a question in the chat box from Diane. And Diane says, I'm so impaired. Thank you for being here today. I'm newly blind author and would love to know how you revise your writing. Not impaired, inspired. That's the correction.
Oh, I am very impaired. Yes, no, that's a stop and think. So I use a JAWS screen reader with Microsoft Word, and that's pretty much it. So speech out, I touch type in. In terms of revising, it goes in stages. One, when it's just myself revising, lots of reading over and over. Again, now that I have Braille, it's even another layer of kind of rereading and editing and spotting things that you missed the first time around. But all of the same things that you can do with eyes, you can do with your ears or with your fingers in terms of, cutting and pasting and spell checking and all that sort of thing. Things do get a little more complicated when you're dealing with editors at a professional level. But luckily, you can access comments again in the Word function. You can access comments. You can, reply to comments, things like that. If you're not a writer, just to explain for a second, a lot of times editors will do something called track changes. So that kind of keeps track of the changes that are being made in a document, but then they'll also a lot of times drop comments in to say, hey, what the heck are you talking about here? Or, haha, that's funny. Or, or maybe you should change your wording there. And so you can kind of respond to that. I will say that track changes can get a little bit messy. I remember when I was doing my copy edit, things got very messy because I wasn't allowed to get rid of the track changes, which is very unsatisfying. So you basically just have a document that just gets messier and messier. But for the most part, basically everything is possible in terms of writing. So, just check into some awesome technology classes at the Lighthouse and you will be on your way for sure.
Thank you for that. Another question from Jay Isaac is, Leona, you've clearly done a substantial amount of research for this book. What is your next research project?
Ooh, that's great. Well, full disclosure, I have a long-suffering novel that I really want to finish by the end of the year. Another thing that has been really exciting to me that I kind of hint at in this book is my interest in smell. And this actually kind of relates to ideas about ocular centrism as well, that there hasn't been as much scientific interest in smell research as there has been into obviously vision and to some extent hearing as well. So I would love to kind of dig deep into the science of smell. Yeah, I guess those are the two big things. And actually my novel's a little bit related there as well. So I think smell is the next frontier and olfaction, next frontier.
Okay, great. There's one for Barbara McCormick here. Please authorize your publisher to send the audiobook to NLS Bard. It looks like
yes, we are working on it. It's at Bookshare. I will say that it is available at Bookshare. I've sent the word out, but it does seem to take a little bit of time. The book just came out June 1st, so there is that. But I'm hoping to get the audiobook over there as well. So we're working on it for sure.
Okay,
and it's available on Audible as well currently.
It's available on Audible. It's available also through Libro FM, which is really great because it can tie audiobooks in with your local bookstore. And again, it is on bookshare.org. So the kind of last phase, I think, as far as I can tell, it is getting both getting the commercial audiobook available on Bard and hopefully eventually a Braille copy too, which would be wonderful.
Awesome. And Jennifer has her hand up for a while.
Yes.
Hi, Leona. This is Jennifer. I think you said you have some history with Enchanted Hills Camp for the Blind. Can you tell us all about that?
Yes, so I grew up in San Francisco, as Brian said, out in the Richmond district. So as I was losing my vision through my teens, I was kind of what I guess sometimes they used to call high partial. So I was missing my central vision, so I couldn't read, but I could walk around without a cane or without a dog through most of my time in San Francisco. So through my teens and early 20s. I went down to Santa Cruz, and I think it was one summer. Oh, well, what I meant to say is that so the Lighthouse SF was my first blind organization. And I remember going there, gosh, I think it was like South of Market or something, kind of a tiny little storefront space. I think y'all have grown quite a bit since then from what I hear. And so I was involved to some extent. I think I did a few classes, a few maybe group, maybe an RP group, something like that. So I was very much aware of the Lighthouse growing up. And I'm not sure what set me down the path of saying I would like to be a volunteer counselor, but something got it into my head. And so I did that for a summer, probably in the early or mid 90s, something like that. And that was great. I mean, it was a wonderful experience. My only regret is that I ended up being a volunteer counselor. I was afraid I needed to work on my Latin that summer. And so I felt like the 3-month commitment would be too much. So my only regret is that I only went for a couple of sessions to be a volunteer as opposed to for the whole 3 months.
Hi everyone again. I forgot to introduce myself at the top of the program. So my name is Lee Kumatat, and I am the Director of Communications here at Lighthouse. And I do just want to thank Leona for the wonderful insights that you've given today, and for writing an amazing book. It's so interesting to hear your experience about your life as a blind woman, but also, you know, about writing a book as well. And I'd love to continue the conversation with you at some point about gender and all of those different intersections that that really do make us who we are. It was a very fascinating conversation. So thank you very much for that. And we are now going to hear from, so it ties in beautifully with what you were saying about Enchanted Hills Camp, because we have with us Annalisa Di Leonardo, who will tell you about herself, but she has been a camper at Enchanted Hills for a long time. And we have this wonderful thing at the Lighthouse and in our monthly staff meetings, which we call Mission Moments. And Annalisa shared an amazing one with us, and we would love to share that with you. Annalisa, are you there?
I'm here. Can you all hear me?
You sound amazing. Go for it.
Thank you so much. So I've been attending Enchanted Hills Camp since 2010. I started off at going to teen camp, and as a camper, Enchanted Hills Camp impacted me in such a huge way as a teen. So I was born legally blind with a variety of diagnoses, but my main one is optic nerve hypoplasia. And I'm the only one in my family. And as a child and teenager at Enchanted Hills, the main way it impacted me was it showed me that I could achieve my dreams. I could be who I wanted to be, and it didn't matter that I was blind. EHC showed me that the world has endless possibilities, and I too could reach those just like my sighted brothers. And I just might have to adapt the world in just a slightly different way. I also was shown that even though I had some sight, I could get a guide dog, I could use a cane. I had all these amazing tech opportunities that I had no idea that were out there. I owe so much of making who I am today to Enchanted Hills Camp and the Lighthouse. And I remember one time at camp, at the age of 16, I learned how to pour my own glass of water from the pitcher from a visually impaired staff without spilling. It was such a proud moment for me, and a little embarrassing sometimes to talk about, because I was 16, and pouring my own cup without spilling sounds weird for a 16-year-old to learn, but prior to that, my parents or my brothers did it for me because I would spill and miss the cup. And it was just such an impact in my life. And now I've been working at camp since 2013, since I aged out of teen camp. And this will be my 4th summer as assistant director. And I just love being able to connect in small moments with other visually impaired children, adults, and families, and bring what I call those magic moments alive. Being able to show a kid how to pour their own drink of orange juice or water, or being able to teach them how to put toothpaste on their toothbrush because they can't see it, and being able to show them that, yeah, you can go to college and achieve your dreams. I just received my master's degree in May and accepted a teaching position for my first teaching position for August. And I have a guide dog, and I have a ton of confidence that I don't think would have been there without the help of EHC, because of the impact and the mentors I have had in my life, from the blind and low vision staff and the support and all the teaching I learned from that. So I am so thankful to San Francisco Lighthouse for the Blind and Enchanted Hills Camp for all the impact they have had on my life and to making me who I am today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Annalisa. So this is Jennifer. I'm the Director of Development at the Lighthouse. When I first met Annalisa, she was the horse area leader at Enchanted Hills Camp, running the whole horse program and the barn. And she had these gigantic boots on, and she was moving all the animals around, and she was lifting kids into the saddle. She was teaching kids how to groom the horses and pick their hooves. And it was just so obvious that Annalisa is this natural leader. And obviously Tony Fletcher, the director of camp, recognized that too, because she's now the longest tenured assistant director at camp. And Enchanted Hills has, led Annalisa towards this life of being a confident woman with a master's degree. And it changes the lives of thousands of campers. For 70 years, Enchanted Hills Camp has been a remarkable center where blind campers immerse themselves and they meet peers and allies and mentors. I know that some of you know that in 2017, there were wildfires that destroyed about half of the buildings at camp. We're taking that opportunity now to really upgrade the camp and it would, get rid of all those outdated buildings and make it the camp that we want it to be, and a year-round natural center for blindness learning. Enchanted Hills Camp is a place where blind kids never are left on the sidelines. They can participate in hands-on projects, they can do sports, they can do science. And we want you to get involved with our big project, Rebuilding Enchanted Hills Camp. We're calling our campaign Building Blind Ambition. We're currently looking for donors for capital gifts for this campaign. So if you or your company want to learn more about the project and you want to learn about opportunities for investing in camp, naming opportunities, please be in touch with me. I'll put my contact info in the chat. I can be reached at giving@lighthouse-sf.org or 415-694-7333. And there's limited opportunities for tours this summer as well. So please be in touch. Thank you.